Hello and welcome to the Royal Society Centre for History of Science. Our lecturer today is Professor George Rousseau, who is a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society. And today the title of his talk is The Notorious Sir John Hill, Georgian Celebrity Science and Attacks on the Royal Society.
A few weeks ago, in this very room, an American journalist came across the big pond to interview the president of this society, Sir Paul Nurse. And he wrote an account of the interview that appears on the New York Times front page of September 21st, for anyone who wishes to look at it. I beg your pardon, September 3rd, for anyone who wishes to look at it. Let me quote some of it. To stroll out of Carlton Gardens into the elegant confines of the Royal Society is to find a treasure trove of century-old wonders, from Sir Isaac Newton's telescope, etc., etc. Then you enter the sun-suffused office of the Society's president, Paul Nurse, with his spiky mass of white hair, broad nose, ready smile, and thick work boots. He looks the part of an old-fashioned knight of science, ready to tramp through the fens. But the Nobel Prize winner in medicine offers a very 21st century lament. Now I quote Nurse on his lament. Policy debate these days involves trying to rubbish the science, always the science, and that is dangerous. Global warming denialists, those who oppose genetically modified crops and vaccinations, or the teaching of evolution, their trick is to treat scientific argument as if it's a political argument and cherry-pick the data. That interview occurred in this very room with some paintings brought in. I'll keep it here in case anyone wants to see it. On the slide before you, you have another president of this society 2 centuries earlier, the second Earl of Macclesfield, George Parker. On the left, Crane Court. In the center, the famous portrait of the Earl of Macclesfield, who became president of this society in 1752, and on the right, an engraving of some of the fellows of the society in debate. Macclesfield was a great friend of the previous president, Martin Folkes, and in 1755, very shortly after Folkes's death, Macclesfield described what an FRS, what a Fellow of the Royal Society should be. For instance, he says, some account of the family. We should know where he came from. We should know the time and place of his birth. We should know where he was educated, the time of his going to the university, not merely the date, but the time of his going up, which of the universities there, then being 2, of course, and what college there he went to, how long he continued there, the time of his being elected Fellow of the Royal Society, what papers he delivered and when, as also what services or good offices he did to the society, what learned men, alive or deceased, he was intimately or chiefly acquainted with at home from the time of his leaving the university. I won't keep my hand up because it's going to get very tired, but it's all the quotation of Macclesfield. The time when he went abroad, how long he employed himself in his travels, what places he visited, what foreigners he then became acquainted with at those several places, and with which of them he chiefly kept up a correspondence after his return home to England, of course. When chosen president of the Royal Society, if he should rise to that distinguished peak, what parts of science he chiefly applied himself to. That's a very political statement in 1755. What parts of science, within science, he should apply himself to and was best acquainted with, what books or books he published, what books he read or was concerned in writing, and at what time he wrote them. Some account, this is delicious, some account of his valuable collection of coins. Macclesfield on what it is to be a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1755. Flash forward, ladies and gentlemen, 70 years. During the 1820s, Charles Babbage, who you know, of course, from computer fame, during the 1820s, Babbage, having been elected FRS to this body, was engaged in writing reflections on the decline of science. For in Babbage's view, science had greatly declined during his generation and the prior two generations. In the 1830 book, Reflections on the Decline of Science in England, Babbage is very clear to state that the decline began in the middle of the 18th century. Babbage was no scholar, he wasn't a historian, but in this book he has some very precious things to say. Chapter 4 might be a very good companion to what we just heard from the president of the Royal Society in 1755 on how you get elected. Chapter 4 is called Mode of Becoming a Fellow of the Royal Society. Again, the hand. I have no intention of stating what ought to be the qualities or qualifications of a fellow, but for years the practical mode has been as follows. Now he elicits an hypothetical character called AB. AB gets any three fellows to sign a certificate stating that he, AB, is desirous of becoming a member and likely to be a useful and valuable one. This is handed into the secretary and suspended in the meeting room. They hung the certificates. At the end of 10 weeks, if AB has the good fortune to be perfectly unknown by any literary or scientific achievement, however small, he is quite sure of being elected as a matter of course FRS. If, on the other hand, he has unfortunately written on any subject connected with science, or is supposed to be acquainted with any branch of it, the members begin to inquire what he has done to deserve this singular honor. And unless he has powerful friends, he has a fair chance of being blackballed. And then there's a long footnote, page 51, on what it is to be blackballed in 1830. In 14 years of experience, the very few I have seen rejected, have all been known persons. But even in such case, hope remains. Perseverance will do much. And a gentleman who values so highly the distinction of admission, FRS, may try again. And even after being twice blackballed, if he will a third time condescend to express his desire to become FRS, he may perhaps succeed. Okay, so that's flashing forward and back and back and forward, from Nurse to Macclesfield and then forward to Babbage. Now, who is this character? Born in 1716, died in 1775. Suppose we consider the qualifications that Babbage required. Would this young man have been elected? And by the way, this is a portrait just recently discovered in the Worshipful Society of Barbers in this city. It's attributed to Alan Ramsey. It's been sitting there for almost a century and nobody knew who it was. If you want to see the original, we made it the jacket of the new biography of Hill. So if we go through the Babbage criteria, what do we get? 3 FRS sponsors. Hill could not get 1. Certificates held up. Well, at Hill's card, they were white cards that were put on the table. And we know very well when the white cards went to certificates within the history of the Royal Society. Must be unknown. Well, Hill was notorious by 1748 when he came up for his first election. He tried again and, of course, was blackballed the second time as well. Babbage, no achievement should do you very well. A blank slate. Hill was no blank slate. Publication counts against you. He had published 3 books, including Theophrastus on Stones, which actually is pretty good, and the historians of geology are saying more and more about it as a seminal work of 18th century science. So, unless he has powerful friends, Hill had no support. Blackballed, yes, indeed, blackballed. Known persons all rejected. He follows the paradigm again. Second and third time. Well, Hill never got to a third time, only a second time. If we go to the Macclesfield criteria, we have a slightly different story. For this is sort of John Hill in the Republic of Letters. Birth, very humbly born, Northamptonshire. His father is a poor parson who believes in poverty and stoicism. Poverty is good for you. Suffer. Only have 20 books. Little to eat. And wrote his only book. His father was Cambridge educated, but there wasn't enough money to educate John Hill, who was a second son. Only the first son, John Hill's older brother, could go to Cambridge. Class and pedigree, he had none. Education, university, none. Self-taught by his father, Greek and Latin at home. Which college? No college. Type of degree, none. What learned men associated with? This is Republic of Letters. And this is what I'm driving at, actually. His acquaintances from the time he left the university. This is all about those 18th century networks that are so intrinsically important to the history of science during the Enlightenment. Learned foreigners, Hill never crossed the English Channel or the North Sea. Which learned men did he meet on his travels? None. Correspondence with which, after he returned home, volumes of it, with the likes of Linnaeus, Gesner, Haller, the men of Middle Europe. And when, by the way, he was rejected by this society in the 1760s, he tried to form his own Royal Society in German with the help of some of the German scientists he had linked up with. Which part of science did he apply himself to? In other words, disciplines, the politics of disciplines within the sciences, such as natural philosophy, mathematics, medicine, natural history, and so forth. During the 1750s, even during the 40s, during Folke's time, there was a war going on within this society about the various branches. The wing of the natural historians, the wing of the natural philosophers. Some were up, some were down. It made a great difference for election to which group you would belong. So we've seen the criteria from Babbage and the criterion from Macclesfield. What was the Republic of Letters? It was no imaginary thing in the 18th century. It was a very vibrant, real network of scientists and gentlemen, of men of letters and artists who interchanged in ways not so different from the modern networking that technology has permitted all of us in this room to engage in. Now, I'm not a sociologist, and I'm not going to dwell upon networks, but the Republic of Letters was all about networks. And in the 1830 book that Babbage wrote about the decline of science in England, he is trying to say something about the decline of those networks in the rise of science as a profession. So in other words, as the profession of science increases, the networks change. They don't disappear at all. They change from the gentlemanly networks of the 18th century that were based on all the criteria that Macclesfield gave us: pedigree, class, university, college, and so forth. Now, visibility in the Republic of Letters was not what we would think of visibility today. It was based primarily on behavior. And you could tell immediately if someone should be visible by the way that individual was behaving. Of course, he's a gentleman. There is some work on women trying to break into the network of the Republic of Letters. It's not very far advanced. It's still primarily the province of males. But this is a behavior group. And gentlemanly pursuits, of course, based on property, based on station, based on pedigree, based on education, and so forth, are a matter of behavior. Now, what is the behavior? One, you must be modest. That's the absolute first criteria. You must not push yourself. You must not instigate yourself. You must not make of yourself something more than you are. Two, you must be generous. Generous of heart, generous of mind, generous in comrades, generous in your relationship with other men of the network, with other fellows in the Republic of Letters. Three, you must be willing to correspond. Anyone in the Republic of Letters who won't answer letters in the 18th century gets a very bad reputation. And since the time of Bale, Bale's the great figure who invents this thing and says there must be a Republic of Letters, and someday he looks in one of his passages at what it will become after I'm dead, and of course it all comes true by the middle of the 18th century. It's a flourishing thing from Bohemia to Belfast. Four, generous, behaving well, answering correspondence. You must collect. Not just cabinets of curiosity and books, but collect so that when another gentleman on his travels comes to your country house and he's looking for an edition of something, remember the libraries then were not the British Museum as it is today, were not Harvard University Library and so forth. You must be able to show him and share with him the collection. These were amongst the gentlemanly pursuits in the Republic of Letters. Now, John Hill grew up in Northamptonshire, began as an apothecary apprentice in this city, identified himself with London, educated himself on the streets of London, in central London, 3 miles within this very site, watching charlatans and mountebanks sell their wares, their pills and potions. That tradition, I don't think the scholars have fully yet dramatized. It went on until about the 1770s. It was very vibrant in the streets. It was a kind of latter-day Charivari, and there were many, many of these mountebanks and charlatans pushing and peddling their wares. John Hill's education was in those streets. But by the time he was 16, 17, he knew Greek and Latin. He knew botany from his theological poor father in Northamptonshire. And he particularly used the patronage of William Stukely, who was a fellow of this society, Stonehenge, Avebury, Druids, all that stuff. Stukely helped John Hill to become a worker in the employ of Lord Peter. This is the Peter, the family. Remember the Pope's delicious poem, The Rape of the Lock, where there's cuts a snippet of hair? Lord Peter in that poem. It's that family, a Catholic family in Essex. And Hill starts collecting for him. From Peter, he works himself up to Lord Richmond, the Duke of Richmond down in Goodwood in Sussex. He also applies to Newcastle and Northumberland, powerful Whig lords of the time. But Hill's greatest catch, you might say, when he's a young man in the early 30s, is the friendship of Emmanuel Mendes da Costa, who became the secretary and treasurer of this society. I'm sorry, I can't show you a portrait of him because none is known to exist. If you ever find a portrait of da Costa, immediately notify someone because it will be worth a great, if it's authentic, a great deal of money. Da Costa was a Jew growing up in the Jewish part of London, very much identifying himself with Jewish culture, and he was a first-class fossilist geologist. Roy Porter says in his History of Geology, much overlooked. Someday Da Costa will be appreciated for what he was, except that he had a weakness for stealing money, for embezzling. When he became the secretary of this society, he ripped them off blind. And as you may know, he went to jail not once but twice First time about 15 years, the second time I don't remember how long. So you might say in a way these two are bedfellows, both unknowns. Neither one can flourish within the Republic of Letters. That's perhaps not unfair because they both have great ability. But remember what we heard from Babbage, that the surest way not to be elected FRS during the decline of science at the end of the 18th century is if you are able. The way to get elected is not to be known, not to do anything, not to have any track record. So Da Costa and Hill are bosom buddies in the 1740s until something rather awful happens. Take a sip of this water before telling you. Hill is at this time early 30s and very eager to publish. He wants to get known as a scientist. And Da Costa says, you know, it's all in fossils. What we need is a history of fossils, a natural history of fossils. And they talk about this in the Adam and Eve Tavern just down the road or whenever they are together. They only lived a few yards away from each other. Hill had no wife yet, but Da Costa had a few Jewish children with his wife, Leah. And one day, Da Costa gets wind of the fact that Hill is starting to publish a history of fossils. Now, Hill doesn't steal from Da Costa passages, words, facts, fossils. He steals the idea. Is that plagiarism or something else? Well, it's very tricky. In the 18th century in music, to steal phrases from Mozart or Haydn is a great compliment. When Beethoven does it of Haydn, it's a compliment. And when others do it of Mozart, Mozart is delighted. In other areas, it's not so complimentary. But this is important to note that he is not stealing parallel pages, chapters. He's stealing a whole idea. And Da Costa is incredulous. And when he goes for his own election in the Royal Society, he's then asked, well, are there any other able young men coming up? And never over my dead body, John Hill. So the last remaining hope that Hill might have had in 1748 when Da Costa is elected to this society is dead. Insider or outsider within the Republic of Letters? Well, Hill is an insider to the degree that he's corresponding all over Europe with very respected scientists. Linnaeus, Haller, Gesner, you know, the list is in my first volume before the biography of correspondence of John Hill. So insider in that sense. And in Europe, on the continent, they don't know. They don't know what they know at home in central London. You see, that's what I mean by the tension of insider and outsider. It's very, very tricky. What one means by insider, outsider, where? The question of insider, outsider is always where? As an outsider, he's incredibly impressive. Haller writes to Gesner almost daily. Has Hill brought out another book? Where can I get it? Please get it for me. Secure it, send it to me. Linnaeus, with his tribe of young Linnaeans in the early 1750s, immensely avid to know what Hill is doing. Well, what is he doing? He's hyperactive. He barely sleeps. He's about 6, by my calculation, 6 feet to 6 feet 2, very tall and thin, angular, with the most affected speech pattern. I can't quite imitate it because I'm not an actor, but it's some kind of an affectation that this Northampton boy picked up when he was growing up in central London and realized would bring him up to the higher echelons. He also strutted with a gait, and I'm going to show you a satire in a minute of his strutting that annoyed people. I think he was the kind of person that rubbed you the wrong way when you first met him. He just pushed buttons to most people, except quite a few women loved him because he was extremely attractive. When he did marry a minor aristocrat from Ireland, the sister of the 4th Viscount Ranelagh, they had 10 children together, and she brought him a dowry, which was the only way that he could carry on. But we haven't gotten to the bomb yet, so let's get to the revenge and the bomb. Of course, Macclesfield knew all about the bomb that Hill detonated on this society in 1749, 1750. Every FRS knew, and certainly the president just deceased, Martin Folkes, knew, and also the new president, Macclesfield, would have known. So what was this thing? When Hill did not get elected the second time, he realized the game was up. He will never be FRS. In this period, without patronage, if you're a poor man like Hill, there's no way you can get ahead. It's either patronage or FRS. So Hill writes 3 satires, prose satires, the butt of which is this society and its fellows, that are quite brilliant. The third of them, Lucina sine concubitu, Lucina gives birth without the commerce of a man, is almost Swiftian in its cadences and tropes. Hill wrote very well. In the 1760s, one of the Linnaean disciples in London, John Ellis, said, "You know, I hate the man. He stands for everything I despise, but he can write, and his sentences flow like a drug. He is a hypnotic to the reader." Now that's quite a compliment from your arch enemy. He detonates these satires, and on the morning when it's first published and people, especially FRS, wake up to read this thing and recognize themselves, Tweedledee and Tweedledum, and there was no question who was who. The correspondence really heats up. So it's, you might say, in the Republic of Letters, but they are writing to one, and all that correspondence survives, of course, and is in the British Library, additional manuscripts. This fellow is a scoundrel, is a rascal, and you can imagine how the claims go. One of the satires is called A Review of the Works of the Royal Society, in 8 parts, arts, antiquities, medicine, blah, blah, blah. So if you saw this treatise when it was published early in 1751, you might not think that its contents are what they contain. This is like Gulliver's Travels or A Modest Proposal. This is not another learned treatise in natural history or natural philosophy. But it's the work on the left, Lucina sine concubitu, a letter humbly addressed to the Royal Society in which he excoriates everything they stand for. And the third one is a dissertation on royal societies. There had never been anything like this before. I mean, Pope in the Dunciad has a few digs at the Royal Society and its fellows, nothing amounting to very much. Before that, the only thing was Gulliver's Travels, Book 3, The Voyage to Laputa, in which Swift really goes after the kind of project that is undertaken in this society. But that's early 1720s, and this is a generation later in 1750. This work, Lucina sine concubitu, has a very interesting history. It's published, notice, I don't know if you can see it on the title page, anonymously. It never has John Hill's name on it, and when it's reprinted, it has some other names like Abraham Rowe on it. So for some time, it wasn't certain that this one was John Hill, whereas the others, the earlier ones, notice the Review of the Royal Society, John Hill, MD. He had paid his £50, by the way, and gotten an MD from Aberdeen, King's College, Aberdeen, at this time. But Lucina never had his name on it. It's translated into French, German, Danish, Italian, and other languages within the first decade of publication, and in the 1780s, oddly enough, becomes read as an allegory of the French Revolution, In other words, that an Englishman foretold that a country, this is an allegory, would give birth without a male, and you can see how this allegory goes, and something momentous would occur. In 1753, a very curious caricature appeared called Lusus Naturae, or caricatures of the present age. There's Hill. You see what I mean about being very tall and strutting. The artist tries to capture by that calf, the right calf, his gait. He is with a young woman called Elizabeth Canning. This was a cause célèbre in the early 1750s. She was abducted by a gypsy woman, an old woman called Mary Squires. She claimed that she was kidnapped and taken to a house of ill repute, but in fact, she was pregnant and was running away from her parents and used that as a very convenient alibi. Henry Fielding, the novelist of Tom Jones, was the magistrate in the case, and he was bowled over by the young woman's innocence. Hill got in on the act and thought she was not telling the truth. The case for 5 months was the talk of the town. No one could say anything else but for or against Elizabeth Canning. Hill prevailed, and eventually the matter came out, and that's one reason why he can appear in the Lusus Naturae, in the print of the celebrities of the present age. This is thought to be Samuel Johnson, Lord Chesterfield, and quite a few others who are identified in the script. You can't see the script very well. Now, as I was writing the biography, and I might say I've been writing it for 30 years, the question of how to frame it continued to vex me. Because if a biographer is anything, a biographer is telling a story. And the story is never the facts. I mean, that's the least aspect of the story. The story is the framing. I went through, I can't tell you how many reincarnations in the framing of this biography. For 10 long years, I thought it would be a psychohistory, a psychoanalysis of Hill, because I was persuaded he was a very marginal personality, almost borderline personality disorder, who has a cachet on sociopathic behavior. And you can see how this one would go. But it wouldn't quite do as a biography. You need the facts to buttress the argument as well. And of course, I couldn't prove that he was such a borderline personality. But in the last decade, I came to see what I eventually settled on, which is that he wants to become well known. He wants to be, as the prince says, lusus naturae. He wants to be a celebrity of his age because he had money. And where did the money come from? He started to write books in 1750, one after another, 10, 15 a year. He wrote at phenomenal speed, novels, especially novels scandaleuses. He beat Smollett to Peregrine Pickle by inserting the memoirs of a courtesan. He wrote the first biography of Lawrence Sterne. It's rather abysmal, but it made him some money. I mean, you look at his bibliography in the New Dictionary of National Biography, it's over 100 titles. In the British Library, it's over 200 attributed titles. In Oxford, it's about 234. And maybe there are more lurking somewhere. He made huge amounts of money, and Henrietta Vicus of Ranelagh brought him a dowry as well. So they lived right here opposite the Ritz in St. James's Square in great style until he almost went to debtor's prison. So it was constantly up and down, up and down. But what was at the base, in the heart of this man, I came to believe, perhaps not correctly, is that he wanted to be a celebrity. So I began to ask myself questions about what it means to be celebrity in the late Georgian period. And that's what the biography is really trying to do. It's trying to grapple not with Hill so much as a figure, but with Hill as a figure filter. Not a figure, but a filter. Now, a filter is one through whom something goes so that you see what's at its base, what lies at the base. And I think Hill's greatest contribution, after all, I'm a cultural historian, and I'm not living in the mid-Georgian period, my interest is what was that 18th century all about. To me, Hill's fame, the enduring thing that will last, is his service as a filter for his culture, to make us see what was really at stake in that culture. Now, if you're a historian of science, you might say Hill's greatest contribution was that he reformed the philosophical transactions of the Royal Society, because after he poked fun in the three satires, and most of the satire comes from individual FRS publishing particular papers. So he's read those papers. He's published three himself before he gets blackballed, and he knows very well what the criteria for publication are. What happens after the 1750s, under Macclesfield, in fact, is that they tighten it all up. It's not enough now just to be a gentleman. It's not enough just to send it in and we publish it right away. So you could say that that is the enduring contribution that John Hill made. And I think there's one more I may show you. Amongst the scientists, Hill was first and foremost a botanist. And of course, Linnaeus in Sweden is the premier botanist. And Linnaeus knows what Hill is doing, as I suggested earlier, every week and every month. This is Linnaeus in his 20s. Hill is probably the first man in England to introduce the Linnaean system of taxonomy, the bisexual system of classification. Now, there's a huge war about this. There are 2 or 3 historians of botany who will swear on a Bible he's the first, and there are 2 or 3 who have 2 other candidates. It's a moot point, but there's no question that Hill is one of the very first. And he is certainly the first to suggest in 1751 that we should use Linnaean classification in all works about flora and botany and plants. So the date 1751 is what the pro-Hillians in the Linnaean argument rest themselves on. Did Hill ever find a patron? Yes, he did. He lucked out. In 1756, he meets Lord Bute, the Maecenas, so-called Maecenas of botany, and Bute thinks he's a very good thing and offers him to fund 26 volumes of a vegetable system with many thousands of pounds, which keeps Hill going to the very end, except that Bute, as you know, fell politically, and once he falls out of power, he did not keep his financial problem. So Hill goes into poverty, keeps publishing them, but becomes penurious indeed. Through the Bute connection and the Linnaeus connection, Hill was knighted in 1773 in Sweden by Gustavus III, a new order that had been founded 1 year before for the advancement of all things to do with the land, agriculture, plants, botany. He becomes Sir John Hill, shortly after which time the Vendramini portrait of him is painted. This is the title page of and jacket of the first volume containing the letters and papers upon which the biography was built. This is a caricature of one of many, the celebrated Dr. Rock in the 1740s, and this is what I mean about the education of this man, not in Cambridge or Oxford University, but in the streets of London with the charlatans and mountebanks. This is the Adam and Eve Tavern very close by where he and Costa would meet. Their collections for great Whig lords. I won't have time to go into the Baker Club. Sir Henry Baker, who was a fellow of this society, had Wednesday evening meetings where the likes of Hill and Hogarth and many men of learning came, and there Hill demonstrated his rather obnoxious behavior. But it is this that I would leave us with. If my framing has any water to it in celebration, I think this engraving contains the epitome of what Hill really stands for. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that lecture, George. It was really interesting, and we've got plenty of time for questions, but just before anyone asks a question, I'm going to grab the microphone so we can record them for the...
Thank you very much for your lecture, Professor Rousseau. I'm not sure whether to infer from the repeated blackballing, in fact, of John Hill from the Royal Society, whether one should infer from that that the Royal Society doesn't want anybody that's too serious-minded. Maybe they're little better than a bunch of dilettantes or coffee-drinking gossip-mongers. And the next question I want to ask you, when was it, would you judge, that the Royal Society would have started being a society that comprised basically of learned men, seriously learned men, not necessarily just scientists? Could you give any approximate date to that at all, please?
Well, Babbage is saying in 1830 that he's still very disappointed. So if I was to suggest, say, the Regency, Mr. Babbage's ghost, as he was a fellow of the society, might lurk and say, you're quite wrong, Rousseau. It's got to be much later. It's a very difficult question. It was a slow evolution that didn't occur overnight or in 1 year. There were administrations of certain presidents that tightened things up, as there are in universities. You know, universities also go in these phases, so one decade may look rather different from another decade. But in Hill's time, in the 1740s, when he's trying to be elected, it's very loose. And Foulkes is in many ways a very deficient president for just that point about serious men of learning. And Hill taps into that. I know I haven't answered your question very well, but I think the historians of science would agree that it's an evolutionary process occurring during the 19th century. I mean, I don't think it's absolutely fixed even by the mid-19th century.
Can I just add that Hill also failed in his attempt to be elected to the Society of Arts? So it wasn't just the Royal Society.
Yeah, he failed to be elected to anything. I sat in my seat in the Bodleian for many, many months, wondering how Henrietta, Lady Hill, put up with him and gave him those 10 children. I don't know. There's no portrait of her either. I say somewhere in this, she must have been an angel or a saint.
Two things. I think I must have been daydreaming. I missed John Hill's connection with philosophical transactions here. And secondly, how did, after all his failings and rejections and dismissals, how did he become Sir John Hill?
Let me take the second one first. The Swedes knighted him at the end of his life. He dies at the age of 61, by the by, of gout. And I think it's gout with other complications, cardiac complications, because he's really quite brokenhearted after Bute disappoints him and doesn't cough up. To have gone all through his life the way he did and have nothing, when he finally finds that patron, and it's no less than the Prime Minister, that's the connection, to, by the way, to the King. You know that George III summoned Samuel Johnson to an interview in I'm sorry, I'm rambling a bit, but it does get to your question, to to see him in 1767 in an interview. And Johnson wanted to please his sovereign. And the king says, I have 4 questions for you. One of the 4 questions is, this is before George III goes berserk in 1788. This is 1767. He says, tell me, why is everyone speaking about John Hill? He's not yet Sir. So you see, the king has an inkling. I think it's through Bute, through the connection with Augusta and Frederick and the Prince of Wales and so forth. But the king wants to know why Hill is on the lip of everybody. So he was tremendously notorious, even in his lifetime. So Linnaeus gets him elected and knighted in Sweden. The Swedish ambassador in London performs that service, and then Hill applies to the crown, very easy to do with Bute in position, to the crown. Can he use his title? Yes. So he's Sir John in England. Now, the first question, I think, was philosophical transactions. That one's very, very important. Hill published 3 papers in the Phil Trans. He knew those works well. He had a good library, by the way, at home. And one of the things in that library were philosophical transactions. So he knew the weakness of those FRS in the 1740s, and they go into the 3 satires. So he'll have a footnote saying Tweedledee and Tweedledum, and then you can see Phil Trans 1746, a paper on mosses by Tweedledee and Tweedledum. That's how the Phil Trans comes in. Well, there's no question that they ought to look at the Phil Trans again. Martin Folkes dies in 1751. President's dead. Macclesfield comes in and says, we've got to tighten up the procedures for publication. So in that sense, Hill has probably done something very important for the history. So I've avoided the literary stuff. I mean, if this talk were not here but across the road in the British Academy, I'd leave all this out and show you all the literary Hill, and that stuff is scandalous. I mean, what he does in literature, it may not be Fanny Hill, but it is scandalous. So the man, you make the excellent point about rejection elsewhere. The man seems to have no gradient of shame. This is what I mean about a filter. Is he psychologically off balance, or is something else going on?
So 2 of the criticisms that Hill seems to be making in his satires are relating to the election procedures at the Society and the publication procedures. Were there any other comments that Hill makes in his satires?
About FRS?
About the Society in general?
Yes. The politics. Hill is not a natural philosopher. He's in the wing of natural history. His in-man is Stukely, who's also a combination of natural history and antiquities, antiquarians. There's also a society of antiquarianism. That's another story. But within this society, the politics in the 1740s are depending upon the area of the science. Now, there's some personal politics also. Of course, that's only human. But the main politics is in natural history, natural philosophy, antiquaries. I mean, this is one reason there's the break-off in the Society of Antiquaries forms and develops. The society doesn't do too well by its natural history wing. And Stukely keeps telling Hill, you know, you should go after them. I go to the meetings, and the natural historians are suffering very badly. Now, what is all that? Natural history, plants, flowers, just the things that Hill is going to write about, and Linnaeus will revolutionize science over, and which Joseph Banks in the 1760s will, of course, revolutionize this science. Hill never met Banks, and I don't know what they would have thought of each other if they did. But Hill is in that camp that Banks is also interested in. It's natural history. We haven't, you know, I mean, on your point, had a really definitive book on the Royal Society in the 1740s. It would be very hard to do. It would take several volumes, because this is when the wars are occurring over the disciplines. It's a bit like literary criticism in the 70s, when they were killing each other over theory versus the more empirical approach.
His stupidity didn't stop Daines Barrington being a very eminent member of this society and of the Society of Antiquaries, and he was a natural historian, wasn't he, and persisted in his belief that swallows hibernated rather than migrated, even in the face of wonderful evidence by Michel Adanson. And he got nothing right, did he? He confused the River Thames with the River Medway, and the Prime Minister, Walpole, said what a fool he was. Banks said Daines has no brains, but that didn't make any difference. And a great philosopher whose name I momentarily, Bentham, said he was a judge, that though he didn't try to be a bad judge, he usually was. What do you say about that?
Well, manna to my ears. And if we went through the membership lists of the Royal Society in the 1730s and 40s, we would come up with many such. There's one character who lives in Norwich. I won't mention his name. There might be someone here who's writing a biography of him and think he's the best thing since apple pie. This character sends his papers to Baker, Henry Baker, whose portrait I showed you. He's a very minimal scientist. Perhaps didn't know the difference between the Thames and Transylvania. But he sends his paper, and Baker sends each one of them in, and they get published. Did the man ever come to the society? I think only once he ventured to London. After all, Norwich in the 1740s isn't so very far, and he's not so very old. There was a lot to be answered for in the 1730s and 40s.
Did the officers of the Royal Society feel the need to defend themselves when the satires were published? And if so, what did they do?
Yeah. The good gentlemen of the Republic of Letters, they wrote to each other and said, "That scoundrel Hill, have you ever in your life?" And it's all in the British Library up the road. Delicious reading. You know, we don't live in that kind of an age now because the law has changed so much, especially in this century. You can't say some of the things that the 18th century was able to say, but they excoriated him. They lambasted him they flayed him on the fisher's table. The real defense, though, didn't come till Macclesfield was president, and they tightened up the philosophical trans. Consider what publication, sir, is now to publish in the Proceedings of the Royal Society. Peer review, how it goes. At that time, you send it from Norwich to your friend, boom, it's published, as long as you're a gentleman and have the right connection. I mean, you do see what the charge is here. This is old boy network of a very egregious type that Hill is getting at, and he pushed all the right buttons. It didn't help him, but he certainly made some kind of a dent on them. You know who understood this? The Prime Minister's father in the 19th century, Disraeli's father, whose name was Isaac Disraeli. He wrote volumes. He sat all his life in the British Museum. He was a Jew. He didn't go to university. He didn't teach. But he sat all his life in the British Museum reading books and wrote volumes called The Calamities of Authors. the quarrels of authors. He saw what this period was. And he writes a very good chapter called Sir John Hill. He says, you know, this is a light whose story should be told someday, because he was a very able man. And there are lots of those voices in the 18th century. Charles Burney, the musicologist, writes a very long letter to Rousseau, none less than the other Rousseau, about John Hill as a botanist, and says he's extremely able. This is just before Rousseau's coming to England, and Rousseau wants to go to all the English gardens. There's much to say for Hill. There's much to say against Hill. In person, he must have been insufferable. I also went through a decade of wondering whether there should be a biography. I don't want to be silent on that one. Several of my friends said, don't do it. Don't write it. It's too controversial.
I don't know whether my question has already been answered by your answer to the question of two questions at the back of the room. You made a statement quite early on in your talk that the Fellows of the Royal Society want to know in which branch of science applicants to the fellowship had been active. You said, now this is a political statement in itself. Was the politics hinging around whether they had an interest in natural history and that physics, chemistry and other sciences and other scholarly pursuits were simply beyond the pale?
Yes.
Amplify, please, on your statement. Thank
yes. Let me expand that. I tried to give, those are the Macclesfield criteria that I was reading, and when I said it was a political statement, if you were a neutral character, in other words, your certificate is hanging or your white card is on the table, and nothing, tabula rasa, blank slate, they won't hold anything against you except what they know about your subject, your area, then it's very useful to be in natural philosophy rather than natural history. Natural history is having trouble in the Royal Society in the 1740s. And that's why there are two biographies now of William Stukeley, and both of those show Stukeley was in that camp. So natural history is fossils, plants, rocks, all those things. Those people are having trouble. It's too gentlemanly. There's a famous print of 1750 in the British Library of gentlemen botanizing, and it looks like a coffee clutch. This is not what serious scientists do. So you see, that's the point about the politics. And you could think of analogies today in other subjects of universities, for example, where that's not serious, we won't fund that. This is serious, we will fund this. It perdures, it endures. That's what the difficulty was. Now, Banks was the transformer of that. After Banks got in, natural history has no such problem. So a Martin Folkes could never have done what he did in the Royal Society of Banks, but this is 30 years earlier.